culture of Scotland in the High Middle Ages refers to the forms of cultural expression that come from Scotland in the High Medieval period which, for the purposes of this article, refers to the period between the death of Domnall II in 900, and the death of Alexander III in 1286. The unity of the period is suggested by the immense breaks which occur in Scottish history because of the Wars of Scottish Independence, the Stewart accession and transformations which occur in Scottish society in the 14th century and afterwards. The period differentiates itself because of the predominance of Gaelic culture and, later in the medieval, Scoto-Norman French culture, oral culture. As a predominantly Gaelic society, most Scottish cultural practices throughout this period mirrored closely those of Ireland, or at least those of Ireland with some Pictish borrowings. After David I, the French-speaking kings introduced cultural practices popular in Anglo-Norman England, France and elsewhere. As in all pre-modern societies, storytelling was popular. In the words of D.R. Owen, a scholar who specializes in the literature of the era, almost all of these stories are lost, or come down only vaguely in Gaelic or Scots oral tradition. Genealogies. One form of culture extremely well accounted for in this period is genealogy. There are dozens of Scottish genealogies surviving from this era, covering everyone from the Mormaers of Lennox and Moray to the Scottish king himself. In the Poppleton manuscript, there is a full genealogy of King William I going all the way back to Adam via Gaetial Glass. The latter genealogy is just recording a partial translation of a Gaelic genealogy, where Mac and Mac have been replaced with Filius and Fili. Moreover, before his grandfather David I, virtually all William's ancestors have their names in the Middle Irish genitive form. Furthermore, until at least the reign of Alexander III, Scotland's kings maintained an Ollamri, a royal high poet who had a permanent place in all medieval Gaelic lordships, and whose purpose was to recite genealogies when needed, for occasions such as coronations. The Lord Leon can be seen as a later development of this role. Literacy. Before the reign of David I, the Scots possessed a flourishing literary elite who regularly produced texts in both Gaelic and Latin that were frequently transmitted to Ireland and elsewhere. After David I, the influx of English and French clerics introduced a break with this traditional culture everywhere they went, even though, as David Brown shows, a Gaelic literary elite survived in the eastern Scottish lowlands. In places such as Loch Leven and Brecon into the 13th century, it was not the flourishing one that contemporary Ireland possessed, at least not in its written literary output. Latin scribes, even if they knew Gaelic, would normally avoid the Gaelic vernacular and, as elsewhere in Europe, would translate vernacular terms into Latin, so that historians are faced with a Gaelic society clothed in Latin terminology. Even names were translated into more common continental forms. For instance, Gilbrigte became Gilbert, Ad became Hugh, etc. Music. In the Middle Ages, Scotland was renowned for its musical skill. Gerald of Wales tells us that the medieval Scots indeed took harping very seriously. We know that, even half a century after Gerald was writing, King Alexander III kept a royal harpist. Of the three medieval harps that survive, two come from Scotland, and one from Ireland. Singers also had a royal function. For instance, when the King of Scotland passed through the territory of Strathearn, it was the custom that he be greeted by 7 female singers, who would sing to him. When Edward I approached the borders of Strathearn in the summer of 1296, he was met by these 7 women, who accompanied the king on the road between Gask and Ogilvie, singing to him, as was the custom in the time of the late Alexander kings of Scots.